Welcome to Uniquely UCF Sociology, a podcast production of the Department of Sociology at the University of Central Florida. I'm your host, Dr. Ramon Hinojosa. Uniquely UCF Sociology is a podcast that explores the research and creative efforts of those who are doing the good work of sociology. You want to know what sociology is and what contributions sociology makes to improving our lives? Well, you've come to the right place. It's Uniquely UCF Sociology. Today, I'm speaking with Kris Davis, a PhD student in the Department of Sociology at the University of Central Florida. Kris's thesis research focused on the victimization and health outcomes of transgender and gender nonconforming individuals in women's prisons in the United States. Kris is broadly interested in gender and sexualities and has a particular focus in how dominant ideas about gender are used to police transgender and non-gender conforming bodies. Kris teaches undergraduate courses in gender and sexualities and in medical sociology. Hello, Kris, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Ray. Thanks for having me.
So tell us about yourself. So where did you do your undergraduate work and how did you get to UCF sociology?
It's kind of an interesting one. So for me personally, I started at UCF. And before I got into UCF sociology, I was not into sociology at all. I found my way into medical sociology with actually Ray here, of course, and found that I really enjoyed the focus on thinking about people and systems and power as it relates to medicine, in how that broadly shapes people's experiences with the system. And from that, I got into also additional interests in those same sorts of systems of power related to gender and sexualities. And so switched into sociology. And so I've been around since I believe about 2016 when I switched. So through my master's and my doctorate.
Okay. And as I recall from your undergraduate days, you were on a biomedical track. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I was looking to potentially do graduate work in genetics or genetic counseling. And it's interesting because a lot of that has to do with social issues and technology and modern, biomedicalization. So I ended up getting to take a lot of it with me.
And that's it's actually kind of scary for most parents to hear this, right? That their children are set out on a course to go into physics or genetics, and then all of a sudden, boom, we sociologists take them and snatch them up and shift them into the discipline. Well, we're glad to
Yeah,
have you in.
thankfully my mother took it in stride. So that's all that mattered.
Well, that's good. Given that I think I had you in the medical. Well, I know I had you in the medical sociology class. So hopefully your mother isn't too upset with me for directing you to the good stuff in sociology.
No, not at all.
So tell us about your thesis research. So you did work with prisoners in women's prisons, and you looked at the health outcomes for those who were transgender or gender nonconforming. So talk a little bit about that work.
So I guess I should start with where I got the broad concept for it. So as a master's student, one of the uh, interesting options for studying inequalities here at UCF Sociology are the rotating topics and inequalities course. And so one term, I got to take a course in inequalities in health as it relates to incarceration and the criminal justice system with Dr. Jason Ford. And one of the topics we ended up on involved looking at outcomes for incarcerated trans people. And one thing I noticed is that, and this is actually a broad theme across transgender studies, is that research is predominantly defined through trans women's experiences. And so one thing I found was that just as we know less in general about what goes on in women's prisons compared to men's prisons, was we knew far less, if much at all, about, for example, trans masculine individuals. So with the structure of the carceral system, you're typically divided by your assigned sex, regardless of if there's been any sort of bodily or even legal changing of any of that documentation. And so it became an interesting site as well as a new population and set of bodies to study and look at how those outcomes could be different. Especially the big concern is related to one, experiences of violence, particularly physical and sexual violence, which for me, as someone who focuses more so on a health framework than, say, a criminological framework, I consider those experiences through a lens of health and public health, and how they broadly affect a person's long-term health outcomes, as well as access to transitional resources, whether that's the formal provision of things like hormone replacement therapy or more informal resources, right, related to the type of clothing that's provided and so forth, and the way that people interact with others. And so I was interested too, because in carceral systems, whether it's men's prisons, women's prisons, there tend to evolve a gendered hierarchy of presentation. And so I was interested in how, for example, in a women's prison setting, how you would have folks who definitely stood out, right, in various ways as having different bodies, what that meant for their interactions, both with the other folks they were incarcerated alongside, and as well as, the systems and staff that were assigned for policing them. And what I found was that in a lot of ways, it mirrors the research that we found for trans women in men's prisons, except there was far more of an emphasis on the risks came from staff more so than the other folks who were also incarcerated.
Very
And
interesting.
that's where that's the big part of that dynamic. What I noticed with the analyses was there didn't seem to be much variation based on like how far along in their transition or how their bodies were normally read outside a carceral system. And that could be because it's such a strict sex delineation system that you do not have the ability to go unremarked or what we call stealthing or passing. You become an obviously marked body in these settings. And also that part of the prison structure is to make people lose senses of individual identity, which is something we see in a lot of institutions, including medical institutions, including hospitals. And also the function historically of women's prisons, including in the United States, is to return women to proper femininity. And so you, again, have these forces that are additionally compressing gender variance. And so that was an interesting thing for me, because when we look at research for folks who are outside of these strict institutions, we see variance in outcomes based on, capacity to stealth, based on conformity to gender and sexuality norms. So it becomes this interesting place where a lot of that gets almost equalized. And we didn't see the interesting sort of power dynamics that you see in men's prisons of the sexual hierarchies and partnerships as well. And so that was something really interesting. And then, of course, something that you always find in this kind of research, which is that you're going to find extremely strong variations along race and class lines.
Now, if I could ask, when you say, risks coming from prison officials, what sort of risks were you noticing in the research to these women's health?
So specifically, it's a big risk of sexual violence, sexual harassment, coercion, sexual assault. And so we know that carceral violence is a huge problem across any kind of prison settings. And so typically, you're going to have a very high volume of men who are staffing, whether it's men's prisons, women's prisons, right? And so you have folks who, you have trans men, right? But their bodies in this, sex setting of female bodies is not going to be read that way, right? It's not going to provide any kind of like a protective barrier in that sense. And in men's prisons, there's also, similar risks of both physical and sexual violence. But there seem to be higher rates of sexual violence between incarcerated folks in men's prisons, and to a lesser extent in the women's prisons.
Interesting. And I think it's quite fascinating how you've been able to take some of the ideas from what we would consider to be traditional criminology and merge it with what we might be considered more medical sociology in terms of thinking about the effects of violence on long-term health outcomes. Certainly, we know that things like traumatization greatly impact people's rates of anxiety and depression and suicidality, and can be lifetime experiences that people carry with them. And so your research really takes some of what we know about criminal justice and the violence inherent in some of these systems and what we know about medical sociology and really merges them quite nicely. And so I wonder, how did you sort of come up with that combination of ideas to pursue?
So part of it starts in the fact that we've always had this interesting weaving of medical and criminal considerations, like in sociology as a younger discipline. And part of that is if we look at the formation of both medicine and carceral systems, particularly in the US, but also in parts of Western Europe that influenced our own systems, over the last about 150 years, we saw this dual emergence of what we think of as the modern mass incarceration carceral justice system in the US, and also the formation of medicine. And so both of these systems work to discipline and regulate bodies, as well as function as institutions that isolate individuals away from society. And so there's always been this sort of push and pull of before, for example, we got a lot of new evolutions and changes in psychiatry and psychology as far as mental health interventions. A lot of those individuals ended up in carceral systems. And there was a hope that once we saw improvements in psychotherapy and in drugs, that would change. And to an extent it did, but today we know that there is still a huge disparity there with access to various health resources and the entrance into the criminal justice system. And two, I think if we're talking about social theory, we have the work, of course, of Irving Goffman. And so his work on total institutions and stigma directly works in that, especially the work of Michel Foucault talks equally about systems of surveillance as formally as the prison in Discipline and Punish, but also connects that not only to education systems, but to medicine, especially when you get into history of sexuality. And so there's sort of always been that intertwine if you start pulling at a lot of those threads there. So I think that's sort of a part of it.
Absolutely fascinating. When you think about, for instance, the higher rates of mental health disorders for people who are incarcerated. So perhaps rather than incarceration, we might create greater medical resources or access to medical resources so that we can avoid incarceration. So that's really a fascinating approach to your research. Now, let's talk a little bit about your dissertation research and what you're doing now.
So, in a fun way, uh, a lot of the background research in my dissertation has also tied into a lot of the systems of control. So, even when I did my thesis at the master's level, I was familiar with a lot of that, but certainly I definitely delved a lot more into some of that formal theory work, right, with like Foucault's disciplinary work and biopower. So, my dissertation is not related explicitly to incarceration systems. And so again, it deals with transmasculinity, but it gets into more of a modern research setting and identity on the web. So, of course, the internet in the contemporary age, especially in the last 10 years, and for folks who have grown up in my generation and after me, some millennials, Gen Z, and so forth, the internet has become a very intimate part of our lives. Something I think that has been emphasized, of course, with the recent pandemic and isolation and leaning on those technologies. And one thing is that research indicates that the internet has been a space where various LGBT youth can explore their identities, can make connections with other people in spaces that can be at least partially insulated by systems of homophobia and transphobia.
Hmm.
And so, since the earliest days of the internet, trans people have been using the internet to connect with one another, to find resources, to share medical information, transitional tips, and so forth, um, as a new formation of informal mailed newsletters and signs of the 70s and 80s. And one thing I noticed as I was coming into sort of young adulthood, my own identity, was there were these interesting different discourses and competing pockets of how to define transness as an identity, as a community, and a lot of narratives of debating pathologization versus seeing its utility, because our current medical system is so reliant on the way that insurance structures uh, affordability, right? When it,
Yes.
especially in the US, with the affordability to access to care. And so it becomes an interesting question where you have this social experience like gender, right? And sexuality and bodies intersecting with hormones and surgery, which are so clearly under the medical purview. And so my work is I want to look at the competing discourses here of more of this medicalist framework versus one that embraces more fluid pathways that may or may not include medical routes, but also, even if they do, is questioning the idea that we have to conform in any way, shape, or form to gender norms as the only path to express gender. And so it ends up being a lot about looking at the history of how we've used medicine to define bodies along gender and sexual routes, uh, the way that medicine and psychiatry has so influenced the fact that we even separate sex, gender, and sexuality to begin with. A lot of that comes from the work in the 60s of folks like John Money, Richard Green, Robert Stoller, and so forth, which is a fascinating thought that I think a lot of people don't realize when they don't dive into it, is even that separation of sex and gender is sort of adjacent a bit to medicine sociology. And another big part of it too is why focusing on trans men is the way I think a lot of the communication of these discourses has to do with research we have on masculinity and policing masculinity. And so studying a population of trans men and variously identified transmasculine folks, both as a population that is trans, but also as a population of folks who are coming into manhood and learning how to socialize with other men as a
Hmm.
novel experience, and learning a bit of a lot of the sort of bullying, but also the idea of like fraternity as a joking relationship, right? Of a lot of exaggeration and hyperbole. So
Mhm.
it's a
And,
big part.
this is pertinent work, especially given that we see in states like Texas now, which are trying to ban medical access to transition care for teens. And so I wonder, does your work explore some of that as well as I imagine that it might?
So I had been working on this prior to we hit 2022 and we get this spike in all these bills. So we've got the one in Texas that gained a lot of attention, but also we've had this cycle of bills across the US. Just recently, I believe in the last 2 weeks, Florida announced that Medicaid and Medicare were no longer covering transitional services for folks of any age, not just for youth. And so a big part of that really does pertinently play on what is the function and overall impact of these competing discourses. And so that's sort of a big thing when you study how people create identity narratives, how people articulate their choices in navigating the world, is that a lot of it's wrapped up in political power and collective identity. And so when we have these divisions and infighting, sometimes it can really distract from some of these larger systemic issues. And it presents this challenge, right? If the justification of creating this emphasis on relying on medical definition and thinking about it as a recognized pathology, how that becomes challenged when we're faced with the threat of having that all taken away, right? When a lot of these laws, the way that they argue is they challenge the medical science specifically. Uh, and so if you're basing an entire community identity based on a medical framework, and that medical framework gets challenged in a larger sphere of, we see social and political challenges to medicine's dominance in the last couple decades, then you've created a threat to that whole ideology. And also, a big thing of it is a lot of these internet communities are also connected to parent communities, to related trans activists who use internet platforms. And those groups are intimately involved in some of the grassroots organization groups that are supporting and also providing even research to a lot of the statements, like the Texas Attorney General cites uh, a bit of controversial, quite debated research in terms of its methodology that tries to argue that we're seeing like an intensification of trans youth, specifically trans masculine youth, due to, and the argument is that they're being indoctrinated online, right? So the exact spaces that I'm looking at. And so, it was quite startling to see that, right? Reading the justification for this new legislation, and then it was connecting directly back to my work.
So the
So
very
quite
spaces that
fascinating.
people go to feel safe and to meet other individuals is the very space that's being used against them in some of this legislation. Amazing.
Yeah, and it in the same way, right? If when you frame it that way, it mirrors in Florida, the restriction of discussion of gender identity and sexual identity in schools, because just like the internet, schools are another space, right, where young people go to have an alternate site from their homes, which may or may not be hospitable to some of these discussions and exploration. And so we see this attack on these varied resources and places of gathering. And I think it's very much reminiscent to the physical deterioration and attacks on spaces like we saw like gay bars, right? Public organization spaces.
Hmm. And so perhaps the point is to disrupt these spaces to uh, enforce certain gender norms that are dominant in society.
Right, absolutely. And you get to a point too where when we're talking about intra-community discourses, right? There are plenty of adult trans-identified folks who are actually working alongside a lot of these groups to uh, embed very heavy restrictions, especially when it comes to youth accessing transitional services. And so that's been a big part of it as well, right? And it really illuminates a lot of those intersecting structures of power, especially class and race dynamics.
Well, let's talk about power broadly. Now, when we come to the idea of sociology, give us a sense of what it's like to be a graduate student. And so, we're sort of for our listening audience out there who might be interested in looking at some of the research that you're looking at or thinking about some of the same issues that you're currently teasing out, what is it like to be a graduate student? How does that work?
So certainly it's a process to get used to the graduate climate. But one thing I will say is, regardless of what discipline you're in, I think that being a graduate student gives you a certain level of freedom and it's a more enjoyable experience. It's very intense, but you get to explore a lot of these topics in depth and you get to guide a lot of your own education and work. And so you get into graduate education, sociology, you get to tease apart a lot of the systems of formation and maintenance in these different forms and expressions of power that at an undergraduate level, you learn some of the basics, you're learning a lot of the immediate effects. But when it comes to, well, how did these systems get going? How is it that they manage to thrive? And you get a look into how much active work goes into enforcing a lot of these systems. And that's important too if one of your draws to the social sciences is to ask, well, how do we disrupt those systems? How do we look at collective organization, which I think is part of it that teases sociology apart from some of our other sibling disciplines like psychiatry, psychology, and anthropology. And so that's a big part of it. And so when you go into graduate studies, you can really start looking into and finding where your interests are and connecting with a network of other scholars who are doing a lot of the same work that you're doing. And I think there's something about the fact that sociology is a discipline about dissecting systems of power that it feels like across different levels of experience and rank, at least in my experience thus far, you can reach out to different scholars and folks are just very interested, especially, a younger person wants to hear about the research and talk about these issues. Oh, of course, that sounds great. Versus some of those hierarchical barriers you get in a lot of disciplines.
Excellent. So when you talk about disrupting, sociology as a disruptive force, how do you mean? What are you disrupting, and what are you hoping to do with that?
So a big part of it, like I mentioned, is asking how these systems are maintained and not just looking at their effects on the world. And since the sociology, we're studying collective groups of people, we can study things like social movements and the way that our collective participation is part of the function of these systems. And I think in many ways it can create a feeling of positivity of this idea that systems of power are maintained through people functioning together. And so this idea that opposing norms is an act that has meaning, and that when you study a lot of the ways that changes happen within organizations and institutions, you can see, okay, well, strategically, what works, right? How do you create, for example, successful political narratives that are going to help you conduct things like grassroots campaigns or transform organizations, if you want to get involved in any kind of political research and work, or if you want to get involved more on your local level and organizations that serve the local community, a lot of the work we do is identifying those needs and seeing how can we use institutional resources to actually work for people in their communities for the concerns and needs they have versus those that are defined by representatives that have never met them.
Interesting. And so where do you see your place in sociology? So once you're done with graduate school, you've written that dissertation, you've got the PhD in hand, what are you going to do with it, Kris?
So this has certainly been an interesting question because I've bounced a bit over the place since I started. But I keep getting drawn back into education and working with sort of the next generation. And it's finding that spot between sort of just creating like this secular churning out of folks in this area. But more so, I'm interested in helping folks figure out where their place is and in sort of spreading, I think, a lot of this information, but not just especially folks who are specifically studying sociology either. And so one thing from my experience teaching is a lot of the times, I'd say the majority of my students are not pursuing sociology as a realm, but the lessons from sociology can be very useful to them in a various range of fields. So when I teach students who are going into the medical field, a lot of it is I have students who are coming to me with saying, okay, I want to make important impacts in communities. I want to be able to provide care to folks who don't have the economic resources as a health provider. How do I navigate these systems so that I'm able to keep that ethical and social commitment and responsibility while also dealing with the different institutional barriers I'm going to come across as trying to be a health provider and working in those systems. And so that I've found is a big part of it too. And I think especially today when you're looking at whether it's major university systems or local colleges, we're seeing a way that these institutions can be impactful in the local community as well and becoming a resource. And I think that's an important route for any kind of academic institution to take, is to not just exist as something that pulls from the local community, but also is feeding back into it as a contributing agent in the community. And I know that like at UCF Sociology, that's something definitely that gets done with the ISBS Center, and the folks I know who are involved in that, right? Of, again, feeding back into the community and having that reciprocal relationship and giving local organizations tools and knowledge to make these changes.
Well, I think your future students are going to be very lucky to learn from you and learn from the experiences that you've had. You certainly are able to pull in how individuals and organizations and institutions all structure this crazy thing that we call society. And I'd like to thank you for your time to come for coming onto the show, Kris. So it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today.
Thanks so much for having me, Ray. This has been a good experience.
Excellent. Well, I'd also like to thank you, our audience, for taking your time to listen in as we discuss all things that are uniquely UCF sociology. This is Dr. Ramon Hinojosa saying thank you, and we hope you'll join us next week.